Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for being here with us today and for your incredible interest in this topic. We actually surpassed our capacity for registration, so we're very pleased that we're hitting the right notes with important information that everyone wants to hear. My name's Linnea Johnston, and I'm here with Clinical Trials Ontario, and we have an incredible group of panelists here with us, and we're really excited we could bring everyone together today. The goal of today is really to broadly share some of the great initiatives and procedures that have been put in place by these institutions with the aim of really benefiting us all and helping us learn from each other's learnings and hopefully identify some best practices that we can all incorporate as we learn sort of the new way of doing clinical research. I think I've gone off. So as we were preparing for this call, I was reminded of a quote that I've seen recently, and I just wanted to share it with you because I think it was very appropriate for what we're talking about today. Mastering transitions are an exceptional skill. Transitions are those times in life that are inevitably come and are difficult to prepare for. However, the mindset of mastering transitions can be cultivated. And I think today, the reason I thought that was so appropriate is I believe, you'll hear today how the people on this call have been really mastering these transitions one after the other as we're all going through a very big transition, as are many of you on the call. So I just wanted to take a minute and say we're really grateful for the incredible leadership and for the collaboration that we've seen through all of this, so thank you. So today on the call we have Katie Raposa, who is the Director of Research Quality Integration at UHN. We have Cheryl Litchfield, the Manager of Grants and Contracts at Lawson Health Research Institute in London. Keitha McMurray is the Executive Director of Research Integrity and Clinical Research at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. And Pat Clifford is the Director of Research and Innovation at South Lake Regional Hospital. And I just wanted to take a minute to mention that we just recently heard that Pat will be retiring from South Lake at the end of this month, which is super sad for all of us and probably super exciting for him. But if you know Pat, you know him to be an amazing colleague and collaborator at so many different levels of the community of clinical trials. And I want to thank you for that. You'll be missed. And we wish you well in your next phase of life.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, so we're going to pass this over to Katie first, just to let everyone know. We're going to have the four panelists share for a few minutes on their site and their initiatives that they've taken and what's in place now. After which, we're going to have some discussion and we'll be able to answer questions. So the way you would ask your questions throughout this is in the chat box. So feel free to start asking questions even while the panelists are speaking. We'll take them at the end of going through all four, but feel free to start asking them whenever you have those questions. Okay, so let's pass this over to Katie.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Linnea, for asking me to join in on this. This is a really current and important topic for us all in clinical research right now. I'm just going to review briefly, there I am. Yes, I am going to review briefly our sort of just where we are with our clinical research restart. It's been, as everybody knows, a lot of work, and there's a lot of people that have been engaged in making this happen across our organization. So just at a high level, our goal is to have a safe and responsible restart of clinical research. Some of our research continued, as I'm sure everyone else's did too. Some of the essential clinical trials can't just be stopped. So we did continue some of our work, but what we are focusing on now is restarting our on-site activity, and with the understanding that it may need to be scaled up or down at any time depending on the current environment. We have defined clinical research in our terms as any human research, so that includes both patients and healthy volunteers, and we're ramping up on both of those. We did have a principles-based approach to make sure that everyone was on the same page. And one of our principles is remote activity where possible, and that includes monitoring, which gets into our monitoring discussion today. Our targets for our on-site activity are in line with our clinical activity updates too. So when the hospital moves from phase 1 to phase 2, we moved with it with the same kind of activity targets to make sure that we're in line with patient volumes and flow and PPE use, etc. We're currently in phase 2 and planning on staying there for a bit. So that means 50 to 75% of our on-site clinical activity and on-site clinical research activity can occur. We have developed some oversight. So one of the things that we learned from this is that we didn't have a lot of central oversight. Some programs were certainly more effective at it than others. Our oncology program has really robust central infrastructure. So we did create some systems and processes to put in place that allowed us to have some central oversight for our on-site ramp up. So we have to monitor things like on-site, how many staff there are, how many participant visits there are, and again, integrated within the clinical environment. So that's just a really high level of how we are. So we're staying in phase 2 for a bit, and we'll see where that takes us. I know currently, anecdotally at least, our recruitments are below the targets of 50 to 75%. It takes time to ramp up. It's not like flicking a switch, that's for sure. And there's lots of different factors that play into that, but I think that's a whole other discussion. Ooh, can't find my arrow. Oops. Okay, so remote monitoring, we have implemented an expectation at UHN that monitoring is completed remotely to the extent possible. And we do have processes in place to assess any requests that come through. I must say that our sponsors have been fabulous and that our study teams are working diligently. And part of all of our studies that we've restarted, some 600 studies have restarted. We've only had 2 requests for on-site monitoring visits. So overwhelmingly, the study teams and the sponsors are really working hard at this, and it is a big change. So we're doing this, to try and limit exposure of our patients, our staff, and certainly the sponsor representatives as well. And but at the same time, we want to facilitate a smooth restart of our research. So we had to set up some things to be effective in that sense, and it certainly required a lot of engagement. This isn't something that one person did. We had to have lots of discussions with our patient partners to make sure the communications and any risks that might be perceived with remote monitoring were addressed. We've had our REB and our privacy teams included, etc. And then again, as I said, the research teams themselves and the sponsors and CROs and our pharmacy, everyone who's involved in monitoring has to be engaged. So we did set up remote EPR access. Initially, as an interim solution, we used MS Teams with screen sharing. And we did have to do a fair bit of explanation with that because Microsoft Teams, when you say screen sharing, it sounds like someone else is driving as the monitors are monitoring. And we actually had it set up so that the coordinator would share the screen, and then the monitor was able to log into EPR using their own credentials, using that interface. It's a bit cumbersome, but it was working and has been working. Hey, I didn't do that. Somebody's changing my slides. So now we have direct access. We've just implemented direct access via our Citrix portal, and that's the same access that our clinical staff use. So it actually is a much more direct, if that's the case, and much more familiar. We do have the usual requisite requirements for access requests, credentials, confidentiality, training, etc., that are still in place, and the same privacy requirements, such as no copying, no printing, etc., for our sponsor representatives. We do still have paper documents. Everybody knows we have paper documents. And so those currently are being scanned by the research teams and uploaded into an MS Teams meeting that's been established. And those documents go into SharePoint so the monitors can have access to them there. The other area that monitoring has to occur is the investigational pharmacy. And so they have been very supportive in scanning documents and spending the time to facilitate the remote visits, but there are still drug returns that need to be done, and that's one thing that we don't have sorted yet, and that does require some on-site activity. So challenges, just quickly, the balance is our big challenge, but I also like to say that all of our challenges are opportunities. And to Linnea's point about transitions and changing mindset, I think that really ties in nicely, because we are looking for a standardized approach, but we still have to be flexible and making sure that all of the needs are met. So this gives us an opportunity at communication and relationship building with our sponsors that's heightened actually in this instance. Change is difficult for everybody. So you'll see I have communication on the opportunities and the challenges side of the slide, because that is one of our biggest challenges and opportunities. There are different structures and setups in all of our sponsors and our CROs and all of our research teams across our sites. So we do have to make sure that communication is central to getting this done. And the other challenge currently still is the time that the study teams have to spend and the pharmacy has to spend in scanning paper documents, and the challenge for everyone in learning new tools and finding a new way forward. But we have felt that this is a really great opportunity to develop new solutions to all of these things that are happening right now. We're looking at electronic source documentation, ramping that up as an opportunity for sure, and creating efficiencies and accelerating some things that were going to be done, and now we're going to do them faster because we see an opportunity, and this really gives us a platform to move into our new normal, because this is really where we're going. And I think this is really a great catalyst and a great platform for us all to work together and make those changes happen. We get to set the stage, and we get to work together to make that happen. I just want to briefly acknowledge we have internally a virtual clinical research working group, which is also virtual, which is kind of confusing. But these people have really worked hard to put this together. I want to particularly thank Mike Voth, Christine Snidel, and Susanna Selman for their hard work on getting this remote monitoring working. And if you have any questions or anything at any time, feel free to contact me.
Thank you, Katie. And as I said, we'll address questions after we go through all of the different institutions. So now we're going to move over to Cheryl. If you could share her slides for her, and you may need to advance them also. Cheryl can just cue you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate this morning. I've been really impressed as we've been moving through pandemic response with the cooperation and sharing of information among the institutions. It's been terrific to be part of that community, and I'm looking forward to learning more this morning. As Katie mentioned, our institution has also used a phased research resumption approach. We started planning in May, moved through phase 1, which involved 20% of maximum on-site occupancy. We're just starting our phase 2, which is up to 40% on-site occupancy. Sounds like we took a little bit different approach in terms of our phasing. So our phasing was related more to sort of bodies on site and the hospital's capacity to absorb those within their clinical ramp up. And so we left it with PIs to prioritize, which studies and study activities would be accommodated with their staff coming on site for within those capacity limitations. Because of capacity limitations, hospital restrictions, travel restrictions, we have taken the position that we can't really support on-site monitoring at this point in our initial phases of resumption. However, we recognize regulatory and contractual obligations to facilitate monitoring, and as part of financial burdens on study teams, some studies have continued to take place throughout the pandemic where medical safety has required ongoing on-site activity. So there is data to be reviewed and payments to flow. So next slide, please. Okay. Okay, can you advance my next slide? I don't have control of the slides. Thanks. I think we skipped a slide. So in May, we consulted with sponsors and CROs to get a sense of what they were thinking in terms of research resumption. And so obviously there's a concern for the safety of monitors and research personnel on both sides. The sponsors and CROs, of course, are adjusting to federal, provincial, and local restrictions, including sort of travel restrictions and visitor policy restrictions at hospitals. Very supportive of remote source data verification. Certainly an interest in access to the hospital's EMR. Interest in the availability of e-source platforms. Very understanding of the changing in terms of workload for sites with remote monitoring. Willing to consider budget amendments. And one topic that was one sponsor raised was of interest, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, was just consideration for some sort of arm's length local source data verification capability. Next slide, please. So as Katie was referring to, there's a lot of people that have been involved in development of our approaches and our documentation around remote source data verification. So the current guidance document has come out largely work of our quality assurance and education program with consultation of stakeholders, including Western's Health Sciences Research Ethics Board and Office of Health Research Ethics staff. The ethics officers have had contribution to this. So the current guidance essentially provides two options. Our preferred option is source data verification through the hospital's approved video conferencing platform using screen sharing or webcam. There's to be no recording or screenshots. It's an authorized member of the research team and the sponsor monitor. Both have to be in a private location. Our privacy office in consultations, they requested that automatic notifications be turned off during screen sharing so that you don't, for instance, have a Cisco Jabber message suddenly appear. Should the sponsor or CRO wish to use a different platform for video conferencing, then privacy and IT security have to be consulted to vet those platforms because Cisco WebEx is the hospital's preferred platform. If we're initiating any video conferencing, then it's through WebEx. Our contracts team has been consulted and considers the current clinical trial agreement language adequate to cover this mode of remote source data verification. HSREB, Western's HSREB, has indicated that an REB amendment is not required. However, this may vary at different institutions. Next slide, please. The other option is to provide de-identified redacted copies of the source. This has an increased privacy risk, so great care needs to be taken to remove direct identifiers. We require a second member of the study team to verify the redaction. Participant ID obviously needs to be on the documentation. We won't know the monitoring plan per se, but the sponsor will be able to advise on the specifics as to the data that's to be provided. It's not necessarily meant to be the entire medical record. And a secure transfer method is required. Our preference is a sponsor portal. Use of a sponsor portal then allows the sponsor to control how that information is then provided to their representative, because we feel there's a greater risk if we're directly sharing to an individual. each transfer has to be logged, date, signature, what was provided. The redacted copies need to be stored in the site investigator, this investigator site file. That's the feedback that we've received from CROs and sponsors. And because this method will not fully meet regulatory requirements, the feedback we've had on this is that when on-site monitoring is permitted again, there will be sort of spot checks to verify consistency between the redacted copies that were provided and the actual original source. An REB amendment may be required, for instance, if the sharing is direct through a secure email to a monitor directly rather than to the sponsor. And there may be additional contract amendment required for this option. Next slide, please. So with the expression in May of interest in access to the EMR, our Quality Assurance and Education team has led discussion with a number of internal stakeholders at the hospital around what's technically possible. Here we have, as Katie mentioned, we have a mix of electronic and paper records in supporting of our research. And so source data verification of paper study source will still be necessary, but we have been able to verify that sponsor remote access is technically possible. And right now we're working on details with Health Information Management and ITS in terms of getting that sort of package together as to what that's going to look like exactly. And then we'll be circling back to our sponsors and research teams to test that out. So, so that's imminent. Next slide, please. So local source data verification, it's something that we're interested in exploring a little bit. It was a concept raised by one of the sponsors on the calls we've had. Whether or not there could be a group within the institution that's independent of the research site and the team and would be directed by the sponsor around on-site monitoring on behalf of the sponsor of that, that source data. We're in sort of early stages of looking at that. We're also, there's also an interest in whether or not this is something that we could provide support. We have a Lawson Clinical Research Services is a core clinical research services group, whether or not it might be possible for them to act on behalf of the sponsor in doing source data verification, or perhaps even relieving study teams of the requirement to support sitting at the computer screen or doing all of the redactions and uploads of documentation, so that the study teams can focus on conducting the study, and perhaps we can provide an internal service that supports them in doing some of this work. So next slide, please. There's some contact information for some of the key stakeholders who have been involved in some of this work, and we'd welcome any of your follow-up questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cheryl. That's great. We have a lot to discuss. I'll turn this over now to Keitha to share with us what they are doing at Sunnybrook.
Thanks, Linnea. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. I don't have any slides. What I thought I would do is just give you an overview of the process that we have followed here at Sunnybrook, and echo what my colleagues have said so far. We have very similar processes with a couple of slight variations. So at the outset of the pandemic, clinical research activity was reduced to that which was considered essential to the care of the participant only. That meant that at Sunnybrook, approximately 70% of our clinical trials were placed on hold to accrual, and interim measures for managing active participants were required. At the same time, as many of you have experienced, we had a tremendous influx of COVID-19 related studies which were submitted for urgent review. We managed that by establishing a COVID-19 research committee for initial review to look at impact and resources, and then followed by rapid review through emergency REB procedures. And while we continued to review all submissions to the REB, we didn't put any holds on any submissions to the REB. We continued to accept and review all of those submissions to the REB. We did prioritize the COVID-19 projects as required. And we're pleased to say that we actually did not have to delay any REB reviews by virtue of the fact that we called several emergency REB meetings to manage the volume. So on that note, I just want to give a shout out to all of the REB offices and their volunteer REB members who really have gone above and beyond during this pandemic to keep clinical research moving forward. Even though some of the on-site activities were put on hold and new studies were not actually initiated at certain points, the REB activities continued, and that was so that when the resumption of clinical research occurred, we would be ready to move things forward. So thanks very much to all of the REB members across the world, really. So in terms of the plan to resume clinical research activity at Sunnybrook in May, like my colleagues have said, we began discussing the plan to restart activities. The plan, however, did have to align with the hospital's plan to resume clinical activity. And the hospital used a tiered or stepwise approach based on patient acuity and certain dependencies, such as availability of PPE, drugs, beds, clinic space, resources such as imaging, labs, as well as staff, while also considering COVID-19 activity status at our hospital. So the number of cases that were in the hospital. It's important to understand that increasing clinical activity, hospital-based activity, takes time and requires careful evaluation. And so no one activity could be increased without input from other areas. That meant that the resumption of clinical research had to align with the hospital's plan. We understood throughout this whole process that resuming clinical research is critical for a number of reasons, for participants, for innovations, for making a difference, to bringing treatments to patients, for staff, for revenue, all sorts of reasons. However, this needed to be done in the safest way for patients and for staff. And so by early June, following a very rigorous and expeditious review, the clinical research plan to resume activity was endorsed by the hospital task force, the research executive committee, and approved by our Vice President, Research and Innovation. And as part of this plan, we set a series of conditions and considerations that needed to be considered. The plan requires that principal investigators must attest that the necessary conditions, so there are required conditions that need to be met, as well as considerations we'd like them to think through carefully. The PI must attest that those conditions have been met through an attestation and agreement to this effect, which is electronically signed by the PI, has to be approved by their clinical lead or clinical chief, and then myself as executive director. The requirement for approval to resume clinical research applies both to those studies that were put on hold to accrual and want to restart, as well as initiating new activities. As of this week, we're approximately 65% of the clinical trials that were put on hold to accrual have resumed. So we're making good progress in this area. With respect to REB activities, the Sunnybrook REB is now resuming regular activities for the most part. However, as you know, as long as the pandemic is declared, we can implement emergency procedures where necessary. However, given that we expect COVID-19 to be around for quite some time, we do need to ensure that we appropriately manage the workflow and set sustainable pace for both the office and the REB members while directing emergency procedures to those studies that truly require it. I would say that our guidance, I won't repeat it all, is very similar to what Cheryl outlined in the guidance for remote monitoring. We have approved the use of remote access to our electronic medical record for purposes of remote monitoring. Monitors are issued a network account and an EMR account to log in through remote desktop. and they need to be scheduled and assigned to the remote desktop. So we did a pilot in the program, our cancer program, which was very successful. We have full support from IT and privacy, and that is ramping right up. So we do expect to have close to 50 monitors scheduled for remote monitoring to our EMR in the very near future. So that's where we are with that. And I'm happy to answer other questions as we go through the webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks, Keitha. That's great. And we'll pass it over to Pat, although he's gone off screen, which indicates he may be dealing with another issue. So are you back?
No, I'm back. I'm back.
Wonderful.
I'm sorry. It's okay.
Welcome.
Sorry. Thank you. And thank you to CTO and colleagues here this morning for the invitation to participate. You know, one of the cool things about going last is that in theory you can have a much shorter presentation because it's all been covered. But never being a stranger to a long presentation, I'll just repeat things that folks have said. I say that with some humor, but you know, in truth, and what's interesting is it sounds like being a community hospital, so not the same as academic and teaching hospitals, so as my three colleagues. In fact, what we've done lines up, so it lines up really quite naturally with our larger colleagues down the street. Just to give a little bit of very quick context with regard to Southlake, so we're a 500-bed large community hospital, about 80 to 100 REB approvals per year. About 50% of that or so would be RCTs, primarily 2s and 3s and 4s, primarily in cancer and cardiac. The other sort of 50% would be investigator initiated, so generally kind of small scale, some grant funded, kind of that sort of thing. In terms of how Southlake sort of managed with the pandemic, again similar to colleagues who have already spoken, we looked at kind of two streams. One, the trials that we had going here that, and particularly I'm speaking about clinical trials at the moment, that were enrolling. So we did pause those trials. However, again, like colleagues, for those patients who were coming into the building, and again, we've limited, as everybody did, access to the building. Volunteers stopped, students stopped, non-essential personnel stopped, I mean, all those kinds of things. So if trial patients were coming in to the building for clinical reasons, and some of them certainly were, and were enrolled in a trial, they continued on. So we did that like others did. In terms of new trials, we did not enroll new patients in new trials, but again, we continue to explore taking on new trials. So all of that work that could be done remotely, all of that work that could be done, we use Microsoft Teams here. So anything that we could do through Teams meetings, through just sort of standard business practices around bringing in new trials, all of that preparatory work, we continue to do all of those things. Our research ethics board continued to meet. They switched virtually. I mean, that was already in our emergency procedures contemplated in RSOP. So I mean, all of that was there. So they continued to meet during the process. There were trials that they did approve during the process that were in the pipeline. Although again, if there were a new trial, we didn't enroll. To kind of Keith's comments about COVID, probably a little out of scope, but we did the same. Brought a organizational panel of sort of experts together, physicians, pharmacists, a variety of folks, including research coordinators, REB staff. Looked at probably 20 plus here. I mean, probably smaller scale than our academic partners. So kind of think about 4 of those. Expedited REB processes, CTA processes, all of those kinds of things. So all of that functioned well, got set up and functioned, proving that the monolith bureaucracy that is acute care can in fact actually go much, much faster when it's incentivized to do so. Lessons that I think many of us hope and pray will last. So in terms of the reopening, again, like others, I mean, we didn't completely close. But in terms of what the reopening process, you know, looks like here, again, to be redundant, but to what colleagues have said, you know, we looked at high-level principles, you know, around patient and staff safety, around you know, ensuring that you know, sponsors were, you know, were on board. So, you know, so certainly there's some principles around how we were going to open, what the priority for reopening would be. Again, currently enrolling trials, first new trials kind of being kind of that sort of that second tier. Our process, again, folks have heard it 3 times, you know, kind of hammered home the 4th time in terms of what, you know, what we did was go to a remote process. So for those clinical trials where monitors, you know, are comfortable with doing, our sponsors and monitors are comfortable with doing remote, they complete their confidentiality agreements. They provide us with along with the CRA, establish the list of patients that they want to monitor. Our ICT team sets up, you know, a VPN Citrix type connection. Our health informatics group, we have the capability in this organization, and I don't know, others didn't speak to it. I'm guessing we probably have the same capability with our EMR we're a Meditech hospital. We are able to actually segregate patients into what Meditech calls a work list, but essentially a file drawer. So versus giving monitors, you know, a pipeline into the EMR, and our cancer center has a specific EMR, the rest of the hospital has a different one. The rest of the hospitals on Meditech, cancer programs on Mosaic, which many cancer programs are. Instead of giving them the pipeline into the front door of Meditech or Mosaic, we can give them a pipeline into a file drawer. We can drop the records for the patients that they want to see in that file drawer, and thus limit the ability to extraneously look at anything else. Not that we have any huge index of suspicion that they would, but it does provide that extra layer of privacy control, certainly. You know, keeps any, you know, possible transgressions really well under control. There's nothing else to look at except the files of the patients that have been identified. So we do that. We're just getting that process set up. The process is set up. We're actually waiting for our first implementation of that process, the first quote unquote monitoring visit, which should happen in the next, probably in the next week or 10 days. And that process will be launched. So I think that's probably it for Southlake. Again, I think very similar to our larger academic colleagues. Certainly derived, you know, some great reassurance and looking and listening to, you know, Cheryl and Keitha and Katie describing their processes. That you know, I think we're on that same track. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Pat. I agree with you. As I was sort of having these conversations over the last month, I felt like there were a lot of sort of different approaches to the same sort of end, but I see that everyone's kind of coming to the same end, which is fantastic for everyone, including sponsors and CROs. I'd like to invite all the panelists to unmute themselves so we can speak easily. And I would like to invite you to ask any questions or bring up some comments in response to each other's sort of approaches that we've shared.
I'd just like to as Pat mentioned, his EMR allows sort of access only to a certain set of records. So the technical solution that we've been collaborating with our ITS and Health Information Management folks on would be quite similar in the sense that only the records of the consented participants that are to be reviewed would be accessible. It's not like a remote access into the entire EMR. It's very controlled. So I expect it's the same for UHN and Sunnybrook as well, just to provide some reassurance that we're not allowing just remote access into the entire EMR.
Yeah, actually at UHN we don't have that ability with our current EMR. So we do provide a list of MRN numbers for the monitors to use. It's exactly the same process actually as what they were doing on site, where they're given the list and the opportunity to access those, and privacy has the opportunity to go back and audit to see which records were. So yes, that's retrospective, but as Pat said, we don't have a high index of suspicion that people are snooping around. I'm sure privacy would love to have a more stringent control on that, but our current health record doesn't have that capability.
And at Sunnybrook, we're the same as UHN, and we, for the pilot, did a, oops, sorry about that. We did a audit just to check and make sure that there was no looking into records that were not on the list provided.
So I'd like to ask a few questions. There's a lot of them coming in. So with respect to regulatory binders and patient consents, are these the types of documents that are being scanned currently? You'd mentioned there, of course, there's paper as well as EMR. Is that truly what's being scanned at this point, redacted and scanned in some cases?
Yeah, certainly at UHN, the regulatory binders, some sites we have found actually are already doing that for their own use as well, but regulatory binders and consent forms are being scanned. And one of the benefits of the MS Teams setting up the meeting specifically with that monitor and uploading those documents, our MS Teams has been validated as secure by our IT and our privacy people, so we don't have to redact, which is a big benefit for the study teams, because the time-consuming nature of redacting and scanning, just scanning alone, but if they have to go through and redact everything, that's an awful lot of time and energy. So we're really trying to make it work. So uploading into MS Teams has been very successful, so we don't have to redact, which is great.
Yeah, that's huge. And what about the other sites? Is that a similar approach with not requiring redacting?
Yeah, Pat, from the South perspective, yes, again, with the Office 365 suite, of which MS Teams is part of, yeah, our privacy people have said the same thing, or in ICT. So there's a big advantage in terms of being able to just upload documents as is, versus having to go through a multi-step process in terms of redacting and uploading. So that's the approach we've taken as well.
Just curious, because we're requiring redacting at our end. Did you require any amendments through the REB for using MS Teams to provide those unredacted documents, or how's that been approached? Our
REB is certainly involved in any of the changes in process, and the REB did require amendments to notification of how the process is changing, but not specifically about the redacting, because once the privacy offices says it's okay, we even are allowing at UHN patient visits through MS Teams. Obviously, the preferred method is through the OTM, but trying to facilitate anything we can do to try and facilitate the research within the confines of the regulatory requirements. But so the REB is involved for sure on amendments and they actually, we're notifying our participants too about the change to remote monitoring. So we had some discussion about that, and so we have a letter prepared, or it can be done in person, or it can be done at the next visit, etc., just to make sure that the participants are aware that there is a change in monitoring. Monitors do have the same access as what they had on site. So a lot of the privacy requirements and everything are the same, right? Like the don't print and no screenshots and don't leave your machine unattended. Those things are all the same, but there seems to be heightened awareness when it's remote. So we've got some IT controls into when they can access those documents and the EMR remotely. But the RAB, yeah, the RAB wants to know for sure about the changes.
I have a question here around IT support. So, you know, it's really kind of the backbone of everything we're doing now. Have you sort of put in place as institutions how IT will sort of interface even with the sponsor when they're having some trouble, you know, getting into the EMR or whatever system is being used? Has anything been addressed there proactively from the sites?
We're at Sunnybrook, we're still working on those discussions with IT. So at this point, it's really at the research team level to facilitate those communications. We don't have any direct line between sponsors and IT for support. Initially, when this all began, network connectivity was a concern because so many people were suddenly logging in remotely. That has improved, so we're not seeing the same technical difficulties, but we're still having those conversations.
Okay, great. I have a question here around the monitoring plan. So this is coming from a sponsor. What do you think the key considerations are if a sponsor needs to go in for their own procedures and adapt a monitoring plan to this new approach? What have you seen that are, you know, critically different that they may need to address proactively for new studies and then amend for ongoing?
I mean, we haven't had, as I said, our process is up, it's ready to go. Our first visit won't be for another kind of week or 10 days. I mean, I don't know, and would certainly defer to my more learned colleagues, but I mean, I think you can do pretty much what you would do sitting in an office at a desk at a laptop or PC. In terms of a monitoring visit, I'm not intuitively, and maybe I'm, you know, I've got a blind spot, so love to hear from others, but I'm not sure what can't be done, quite frankly, remotely. You know, yeah, there's some process elements involved, but the process elements in showing up at a hospital, parking your car. I mean, you know, they're processes, right? It's a different process. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that it is specifically different. It perhaps is a bit more time consuming, particularly if you have to look at some of the paper records and sort of navigate through Teams and or what, you know, SharePoint, like whatever, you know, whatever system, whatever repository those paper records are in. That, you know, is probably more cumbersome, a little more difficult than being able to page through a binder and see the tabs and so forth. So some of that I think might be a little rough around the edges. It's doable. So I would think budgeting more time would be one of the pieces. But I'd be open to colleagues' thoughts, but I don't see it as remarkably different.
What are your thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree too. I think that this is one of the key points for discussion with the sponsors and the CROs and the sites together, because I think the initial thought is we have to be on site. And that those are the things that we really have to work through to say, you know, we're working with the sponsors individually and saying, well, what is it that you need on site? Because let's see if we can facilitate this, because we really want to support the studies going forward, obviously, and the monitoring, but let's have a really new, fresh look at it. And if you really think about the monitor sitting in a conference room with the EMR open and a binder of paper beside, is there really a way we can recreate that? And there's going to be opportunities for us rather than uploading into some repository. Maybe there's another opportunity, a better way to do it. But currently it seems to be working. I would actually love to hear from the sponsors to see what it is that we need, because as you know, Linnea pointed out in the very beginning, it's about change and it's about transition. So we need to, I think, take a step back and say, what is the difference? So what time you're spending perhaps learning the new systems, because that's obviously a learning curve for everyone, you know, developing guidance for your researchers and your sponsors and having that liaison with them. You're also saving the time that you're spending, like Pat said, driving to the hospital, parking your car. There are restrictions on travel. You know, we're trying to really limit exposure that way. So monitors sometimes travel a lot, city to city, site to site, province to province, and sometimes across border. So you're saving the time and energy of the travel. So perhaps there is a benefit, and that's where we really want to work together to see what is it that we need to do to make it work as best we can.
Yeah, so we have another question that kind of leads into this. So a lot of sponsors have sort of hit their own hurdles, as you have hit yours, in terms of that's not what our SOP says, and privacy doesn't really feel comfortable. They have the exact same sort of issues on their side. So in the case that a sponsor would not allow redacted documents to be considered, you know, monitoring true source document verification, what are your thoughts, all of you, around how does a sponsor then move forward? So they've got a bit of a hurdle, you have a process in place. What's the next step to getting beyond that hurdle? Because everyone is working together. It's a time of finding new solutions. What would you suggest, each of you, in terms of the next step for them to move forward?
Probably that communication piece that, you know, Katie really emphasized in her presentation. I mean, there's a lot of consultation, you know, going, you know, between each of us, you know, calling certain colleagues in the CROs or sponsors that we have good working relationships with, and just asking the questions, you know, this is what we can do. What can you do? How do we meet in the middle? Who do we need to engage to try to make those changes and make that work? So I think so far everybody's been, you know, super accommodating, you know, working internally as well. There's all that activity happening, you know, with the sponsors and CROs. It's a big change, and I mean the pandemic actually, you know, gives us opportunities. You know, the way we deliver, you know, clinical care is changing dramatically, and I don't know that it'll ever go back. I mean, they're looking at, you know, safe, patient-centered, you know, virtual care methodologies, and I don't know that we'll ever go back. And the same is going to be true of how we do clinical research, including things like monitoring or source data verification. You know, as Katie said, there may be actual benefits to doing it this way if we can get through some of these hurdles, and we may never go back. So I don't know. I think it's just that communication piece and that dialogue, and just, you know, really trying to figure out what can work.
Yeah, I agree, Cheryl. I think that the communication piece is so important, and one of the challenges that we have across UHN is that we have multiple sponsors, obviously, multiple CROs, and different interfaces between those, and it's not always consistent from the same sponsor for different therapeutic areas. So finding the right person to even do that communication has been a new challenge for me, shall I say, because we generally rely on the PIs and the individual sites to communicate with their sponsors. And so trying to find somebody who can work through those issues at the sponsor level or the CRO level as a whole is really important. And we're kind of digging around to try and find the right people, because one site might have it sort of set, all sorted out, and another site might not be on the same page with the same sponsor or the same CRO. So communication is really, truly, as Cheryl said, it's an opportunity. This is something we can build this, how it's going to look, because we are not going back to the way it was. I'm not saying that as in a belligerent way. I think the world has changed, and clinical care certainly is different, and we have to adapt to it, and we can lead it rather than just following it. I think we can lead it.
Yeah, it's Pat. I again echoing, you know, Cheryl and Katie. Part of my portfolio and part of my distraction today is related to some clinical stuff here. So some of my portfolio is clinical, but yes, good heavens, I mean, most of us don't want to see it go back. to being exactly the way it was, both on the clinical side, but also on the research side. So coming back to the question, Linnea, that you're asking about in terms of the sponsor, to Cheryl's comment and Katie's about communication, I mean, it is an opportunity, and it's not adversarial, and so, to me, it's that opportunity for a dialogue between sponsor or CRO, research office, privacy around, so you don't start from a position of, no, we can't do that. We start from a position of, so how do we make this work? And so the kind of the redaction piece, yes, we've got a system that has gotten the stamp of being secure. Yay, wonderful. We probably didn't know that when we got it, but we're happy that we found that out along the way. But if that's not the reality, then there are lots of ways to share secure documents. So it is that collaboration between sponsors, CRO, acute care hospital around. So how if you need the document and you need it unredacted, and that's part of the deal, then we need to figure out how to get it to you. And there's more than one way to do that. Again, it takes time, it takes patience, it takes bandwidth. So those are all considerations, and it's about working relationships between research, for instance, and IT. And there's a question earlier about, the extra strain on IT, and I mean, we park their car for them, we send them chocolates and flowers, and again, I'm joking, but we're lucky that our IT folks are cooperative and helpful. The crunch has died down. They don't have hundreds of staff now trying to log on from home, so they have a little bit more bandwidth than they did. But it's developing those working relationships and bringing people to the table with the mindset of, we need to find a way to move this forward. And our experience has been, and it sounds like others on the call, that for the most part, folks cooperate. They do that. They figure it out. And it's a huge opportunity going forward.
That's great. I'm watching the time, and as I suspected, there were way more questions than we had time to answer, but we will indeed follow up after this call. So I want to thank the panelists. I think everybody in the silent audience is cheering and just so excited that they see an opportunity too, knowing that, we're all in this together and looking for solutions, and it's a great opportunity to find the best practice at this point. So this has been recorded. This will be available to people who are on the call as well as others who couldn't make it. And I also wanted to share that we'll be talking about some other issues on future calls beyond remote monitoring. We wanted to start here because it was such a meaty topic and of critical concern to sponsors and CROs especially, but obviously also to you because you've created these solutions. But it sounds like the main message is communication is key, and the door is open to communicate and find those solutions. So I thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to close the call in respect of everyone's time, and wish you a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks.